Hi, David.
Hi, Chuck. It seems like this machine works,
It does work.
and you have a nice backdrop.
That is my front yard.
Well, you live in a nice neighborhood.
I do. I do. I live at a conservation subdivision, and
Oh,
so I snapped a picture of the front yard on a sunny spring morning to use as my backdrop.
and has the conservation subdivision been successful?
It has. It has. And actually, even after we moved in, they added more to it. So it's probably a Randall Errant project, and there was probably about a 50% set aside to start with. The homes are clustered in pods, and it's a kind of a peninsula kind of landscape because there's only one main road, but there are no homes that are located on the main road. So it kind of comes down, and it's all there's very little curb and gutter. It was all just sort of a ditch design and minimum footprints. And then we have impervious service limits and all that kind of stuff. So you wind up with lots of green space.
And is there much written about it?
There's not much written about it. There's not that many conservation subdivisions around this area, and not much has been talked about in terms of this. The developer, he was even so concerned about stuff that he basically has gray water as the irrigation water for for people that want to. The yards are pretty minimal for the
So
most
your
part.
front yard is watered with gray water.
Exactly, it's
Well,
non-potable water.
nice.
So we're off well water, and then we have our own packaged sewer treatment plant.
You know what? Another volunteer board I serve on is called the Future Fund Land Trust. And here in Louisville, we have the Parklands of Floyd's Fork, which is
Mhm.
in the Floyd's Fork corridor.
Right.
And the Future Fund owns about 5,600 acres
Wow.
of land. About a half of the park is leased to the park by the Future Fund.
Okay.
And they've done some interesting subdivisions along it. The 21st Century Parks people have,
Hmm.
and there's been some consternation about how they went about it, and
Hmm.
all of their money from the subdivisions go back into the maintenance of the park. So
Okay.
it's sort of a interesting relationship,
Yeah.
and the developers just wanted to maximize the amount of money they raised for the endowment for the park.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
and so
That's
it was interesting.
interesting.
But
Yeah.
above and beyond that, the Future Fund we have another 10 miles downstream of Bardstown Road where the park ends. So we just finished purchase of another piece, about 3 months ago or so, another 115 acres. And that's sort of one of our thoughts. We aren't going to develop, the land is conservation land, but all the land adjacent to it is fascinating development opportunities.
Well, Randall has two great books that go into incredible depth on the type of neighborhood I live in. So if anybody's interested, they can Randall Errant and Conservation Subdivision. He's got two really, really, really detailed books with tons and tons of examples of where he's done this work across the country. And he writes about. I mean, it's really a book about conservation, but it's a book about conservation in the vein of land development. How to do both. And
Well, that's fascinating. I will check that out. We have four of us. Brewster might be
hi,
calling in. He's
hi,
driving.
Jeff. Hi,
Uh,
Russell,
and
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 Andrea. Hmm.
and Gordon should be joining us,
Okay.
seeing that was set up around his schedule of 3 o'clock, but that's
Sure.
okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, just as an update for Russ and Andrea, who have not been involved in this email train, but Gordon Garner, who is a colleague of mine, has become a partner of the Recreational Trail and representing the Kentucky Waterways Alliance. And he recommended that we have a conversation with Mr. Flink, which we did about several weeks ago,
Hmm.
about his thoughts on the recreation trail, and just sort of to spur our thinking. So this is a follow-up call to explore the feasibility and what it might look like and what we need to do to proceed further. As a little bit of a background, Chuck, Jack here is our strategic planning committee and has done some work on looking around the country on recreational trails and how they're managed and such. He's involved in a local trail business right now in Dearborn County, planning trails with the county, and is a retired park guy who probably knows more about planning than many, except for Russ and Andrea, who I'm not sure if you've met. They're with the National Park Service and are liaisons for this. And I invited them today because one of the thoughts they had was working with individual river towns on river assessments and sort of a conversation, and so we could talk through that a little bit as well. My intent today is to sort of see if we can get some sort of discussion going, and July, the first Monday in July is our next board meeting, a steering committee meeting.
Okay.
What would be ideal is by then to have some sort of agreement that we can all say, yes, we'll work towards this. Anything else before we, turn the show over to Chuck and Russ or Andrea? Or you're muted, Andrea. How about now? Up. I think we're in trouble.
Hey, David, can I jump in while Andrea is trying to fix her audio?
Sure.
Just, Chuck, just give you a little more background about myself. I'm a landscape architect by trade, but spent 33 years in the world of parks and recreation.
Awesome.
A little bit of that in the state of Georgia DNR, and then last 30 plus years here in the Cincinnati area, a metro park called Great Parks of Hamilton County. So I've been involved in a lot of greenway and trail projects the last 30 years, primarily in greater Cincinnati. So I just throw that out there as a warning that I probably know just a little bit to be dangerous, but not enough to solve a lot of problems.
That's great. Fantastic.
I think you and I have a lot in common from that professional perspective.
Sure.
Again, most of my work has been in the public sector. I have served on some nonprofit boards. So one of the things, I'll just throw it out there, we discussed with you last time was animals. And as we look at how we organize, I'll just throw that out for David and everyone. That's kind of one of the things I am concerned about, is how do we continue to feed this animal and be sustainable as an organization.
Sure. Oh yeah. So you're Jack, you're familiar with the Mill Creek Restoration Project?
Oh yes. Yeah. I know the folks there and very well.
So I worked on that master plan for a couple of years, and that was many years ago, but anyway.
So one of the parks in my domain at that time was Winton Woods, which is in the kind of the headwaters of the Mill Creek or West Fork of the Mill Creek. So
right.
A lot of relationship with those things.
Yep. Sweet.
We want to make sure we cover is making sure we're getting input on the trail from a design and access stand on the Avondale community. Because, I think, what makes a trail 65 Park, may be different in Avondale. The number of access points might be
Brewster, we can't hear you really.
I'm sure you can't hear me.
Now we can hear you, Andrea.
Oh, good. Well, I wanted to say hi, Chuck. I've met you a couple times at various conferences like Maytag and the International Trail Symposium.
Right.
You've been at a number of those things, and it's a pleasure to work with you again, potentially.
Yeah,
and,
thank you.
I did just get this, so I'm interested in reading that.
Oh, fantastic. Good.
it looks interesting. So.
Good. Well, it's good to be on the phone with all of you, and I think that I had a sort of an introductory call with a group of folks that are associated with the Ohio River Recreational Trail, and we were just sort of just shooting things around and exploring what they would like to do and what they'd like to become. It's challenging being in 3 states, and then having such a long distance corridor that you're working on. And we kicked around a lot of different ideas, just a lot of based on what I've done in different parts of the country.
Definitely for them and perhaps some of our other partners in the community.
I'm getting some background noise in. I'm not sure what it's coming from, but do you all hear that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right.
Brewster just muted his phone call.
Oh, okay. Very good. So one of the things, Russell and Andrea, that I did was we went in with Susquehanna River, and they were kind of in a similar position. They were sort of an ad hoc. They were being run out of Cedarcog in the central part of Pennsylvania. It's 22 counties, 500 miles. They had a notion of wanting to become a bit more structured, a bit more organized with their work, and didn't really know what next steps to take. And so we went in there. This is probably back in probably 03, 04, 05, something in that neighborhood. Wrote an action plan, and then out of that action plan, we basically formalized their organization. So we set them up as a 501c3. We helped them seat their first board of directors. We defined staff positions for them. They went on to hire those staff positions, and they've sort of been off and running ever since. And then I was talking with David and Gordon and Brewster and others the other day. They had said, well, wow, that was one organization that we were sort of looking at as a model. We studied that pretty hard because we did see some similarities. And I connected Brewster with Jerry Walls, who Jerry is retired now. He's like a director emeritus, but Jerry was involved really from day one with the formation of the Susquehanna Greenway. And so I figured that Jerry would be a really good resource for Brewster and the Ohio River Recreation team to talk to, because I felt like in reviewing where Ohio River Recreation Trail is today, that it reminded me a lot of where Susquehanna Greenway was when we entered the fray, what is that now, 15 years ago? And so I thought there were some nice parallels there. And it's always kind of a little difficult to know when you're in these, there's a lot of passion. There's a lot of people agreeing. People are sort of seeing the pathway the same. But then, what are the appropriate next steps? How do we take our passion and turn it into something that has the opportunity to be implemented and really be impactful? And so I've done this on a couple of occasions where we've taken some folks who were wanting to take those next steps. So that's certainly something that I have a lot of experience with. I've ginned up organizations, that I just did this in Memphis Metro with the Mid-South Greenprint, which was a multi-state 500-mile regional greenprint. They had a master plan. They sort of got launched, but they were out there and not really knowing what the next step was. And so we just went through a year and a half, almost 2-year process of getting them ginned up and going. So I guess part of the call today is try to understand where folks would like to go, because I'm really not on the call to sort of sell services per se. I'm here to listen, and if I could be value added, if there's something I could do to help get everybody moved to the next step, I'm glad to be there, whether that's just advisory or something else. But certainly have had this experience in doing this with other groups and organizations. So that's just something that I wanted to start off the conversation with today.
I'll say, go ahead, Gordon.
David, do you want to ask the big question or me?
Go for it, Gordon.
Okay, rather than dance around, from my point of view, I think, I'm a go big person. So what I'd like to know is, well, on in terms of your involvement with an organization like this, and you've looked at where the organization is. What would it take to really take the planning to the next level and provide that kind of guidance to develop the organization further? If we were going to go, for say we want to be like Susquehanna and we want you to help us get there.
Sure.
What level of effort would that take? What should we be looking at or thinking about if we're going to go all in?
Yeah, I think I think there's a lot already that's been sort of laid out in terms of people are in agreement about the corridor. People are in agreement about the sort of the end product they'd like to see. I mean, they sort of envision a greenway in the broadest sense of the word, which manifests itself as in parts blueway, maybe part land-based trails, conservation, mix of things, economic development, river towns, those kinds of things. What Susquehanna needed was sort of an action plan, which is what we called it. They needed to figure out how to take all this energy and translate it into a plan of action. So what did that mean? What was the organizational framework that they had to have in order to be effective? How were they going to fund the organization? What was the annual work program? What did that look like? What were they doing, every month for 12 months out of a year? What was the framework that they needed to undertake that? They needed to have a more formal organizational structure. They needed to have a board of directors. They needed to have an operating plan, those kinds of things. So it gets really into kind of a business plan development, which is they did not have that. They had a vision document. They sort of had a vision of where they all wanted to go, but they did not have a roadmap or a game plan for how to get from the vision to something that was implementable. And that's essentially the services that we provided. And it was a couple year effort, and it was a very much a participatory thing. All the partners were involved. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was involved. There were federal agencies involved, various federal agencies, because the Susquehanna touches quite a bit of federal land and waters. And so the vision of going big, that's exactly what they did. And I think when I say that, the way in which that work program gets carried out is a great question as to who does what. But in the case of Susquehanna, they sort of wrapped it all into a consultant contract, and it was given to us, and they said, you tell us what to do. We're going to follow. We're going to put you under contract. You're going to be the lead. You're going to tell us what to do, and then we'll come in and do what you ask us to do. So we led them through a process that got them to the finish line. And the very tail end of that process was that we established a brand new 501c3 under the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We seated a board of directors, and we defined and hired the very first staff positions. So that's the parallel. That's the big picture. That's what I think this organization, this is where you might be today, if you all agree that that's the steps you want to undertake.
I would say that is where they are, and we've talked about it. I'm sure that you've worked with Rivers Trails Conservation Assistance before.
For many years.
In many of your projects.
Yeah, going way back. Mm-hmm.
And that's something that Russ and I have really talked about is we're struggling with where they are. Lots of good ideas, lots of enthusiasm, lots of great work that's been done. But what are the goals? What does the future look like? What does the management structure look like? And we haven't been able to necessarily come up with those answers, but
Sure.
That's the kind of direction that we've been heading. And Russ and I together want to do more community engagement, engaging the communities along the way to build it up. So that could be a perfect complement to any work that you would do, but also knowing that RTCA can add to the discussion and the goals of exactly what you've been talking about. One of the projects that I've been working on is the Industrial Heartland Trails Coalition.
Yep.
48 counties,
Right.
4 states, so big, so big. I mean, it's very similar to this, and struggling with many of the same things too. How
Yeah.
do you wrestle this beast into something that is as productive as it can possibly be, and get the best outcomes for everybody who's involved? So I defer back to Gordon in asking the big question, but consider the ways that RTCA would be of assistance to you in
Oh,
this.
sure.
So
Absolutely.
it would be like multiple consultants.
It would.
You know?
Yeah. It's a big job. And here's what I can do, Gordon. I can kind of lay out the roadmap, right? I can tell you that these are the component parts of the work program, without defining who would necessarily take on that component part. And then there can be a discussion of who's best suited to run with certain elements of this. There's always a tendency, with some of these things is to turn it over to a consultant team or whatever. That's certainly one strategy, but there's another way in which you sort of look at it and go, well, we could take that piece on, like your committee, your existing ORRT committee could take on certain elements of this. The RTCA could take on certain elements of it. I might take on certain elements of it. So, but I can lay out what I think the roadmap should look like. What are the steps that I feel that you should take, and then we can figure out how to take those, and who does what. So
I think that would be helpful for everybody.
Okay.
But I'm new to the group, so I shouldn't speak for the group. I'm looking
Understood.
as somebody that's new to the group, but I have done a lot of strategic planning and
Right.
so I just look at where everything is, and I think, well, what would it take to take it to the next level? And that's why I'm kind of pushing that discussion.
And
well, we enjoy having new young voices on our committee, Gordon. And
yeah, right.
You're our youth, I think. And I agree. I have a sense of urgency. I wanted to echo what Andrea said, and I think Russ, who was on the phone call earlier, would say the same thing, is that we are in part struggling. I think they've helped us tremendously. So, over the past year, it's really grown from a couple of ideas to 40 partners who are willing to sign on and say, we're a part of this. And so the challenge is, during this time of virus and everything else, there's so many issues going on in these river towns. And are we part of that future possible answer? I think some people think we might be. And so there's a sense of urgency that I don't want to get too far into identifying who does what, which you have to do. But, like to do something. How about you, Jack? What do you think?
Well, yeah, I think I'm very much in agreement with what's been said. One thing I've been looking at, and we've all seen this in our textbooks, there's really 4 stages of group development. You've heard it: forming, storming, norming, and performing. And I think we're right in the storming part. I don't think we're that far along, because I just wrestle with what is it our customer needs, and can we provide that? So part of me, I'm looking for that business model that says there's a compelling need out there on the Ohio River corridor, 274 miles. There's an unmet need that only we can provide, and that may be a pipe dream. I'll be candid. Often I think I hear us talk and we're saying, oh, we want to do this and do that, but I come back to looking at some of the communities that I'm most familiar with, and their main streets and their basically town governance, they're struggling with sort of the day-to-day, and they'd like to do tourism, and somebody over here is doing tourism. So I'm getting a little bit erratic here, but I just feel like we're very much in the early phases of group development, and I would be wanting to focus on that second stage, that storming. How do we come together, kind of peel the onion back and get to an agreement on what's the compelling need, and what can we fill that, and what's it take to do that?
I think that's well said. Jack, and I think that's exactly right. I think you really want to go at this from a need base, because if you can keep that in focus as a need base, then it's going to solve the buy-in questions that you're likely to get. And I would divide this into two major proposals. One is an action plan, which begins to address some of the forming, norming, storming, and conforming. And the second is a business plan, which is essentially an implementation approach to how you execute all of this. One thing that you guys share in common with Susquehanna right off the bat is your river towns. And you've got about 45 of those, if I remember correctly. So it's interesting today, because despite the fact that, you know, we have a federal agency and we have state agencies and so on and so forth, what the need, if I get back to Jack's question about need, what happens though is that there's this need for more of a strategically focused resource group that comes in and really addresses the issues of those towns, especially around the area of economic growth, and how do they relate to the resource. So there's this relationship that they all have, that they all share, and that is the relationship to the resource. And they want to know how to maximize that resource, not in an exploitive way, but in a relationship that's beneficial. And when you have a river in your river towns, and you have both, you know, sort of blueway issues and then land-based issues, the question is how to best address, you know, all those opportunities, as well as constraints and liabilities, because river towns also have problems that they have to deal with. And I think that's the advantage of going through a process like this, is that this Ohio River Recreation Trail and what it becomes essentially becomes a kind of a resource group that is very strategically oriented to the 45 plus communities that are along the designated length. That's what I believe the Susquehanna Greenway has become in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It's become the place where all these river towns can go to have a conversation about what they all share in common. It's not like they don't still depend on the federal government and federal agencies for some assistance, or they don't depend on the Commonwealth and the various departments of the Commonwealth to help them. They still do. In fact, those are their best partners. But when it comes time to figuring out strategically what they're all going to do, you know, individually and collectively, a lot of that has become a lot more crystal clear for them as a result of the Susquehanna Greenway and the laser focus it's put on that resource. So I think that's the same kind of benefit that would be derived from the you guys formalizing yourselves and becoming more of that resource of, you know, in this 3-state area.
Coming up, our next webinar is just on that topic. We have the Tennessee River line with the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, and they have about 35 river towns. And then the Great Miami Riverway that has been going now for about 15 years, basically both supported by their river towns. And so it's a collection of their river towns, and just it's that purpose. Tennessee is just getting started. They seem to have a little more money, maybe from TVA, but the Great Miami River seems to be, you know, very solid and interesting collaboration. And the person who's director of that now was a county commissioner for one of the counties, and it's all about economic development of the river towns as well as protection of the resource. I think both of them have a pretty strong sense of, you know, not only is it economic development, but it's protection of the resource, because they realize that if it's even perceived to be dirty, it's not as big of a tourism drawer.
Right.
And then an additional issue here, because I fully understand and appreciate the role we have the ability, perhaps, if properly organized, to play in essentially being a resource to each of these river towns about what we think they might be able to do to help improve their economic development, attract more travel and tourism, et cetera. I also think we can play an important role in promoting public appreciation for the ecology and environment, that aspect. But I think the third piece that I think it's absolutely critical, because if we don't do this, we don't have that much to deliver to the river towns, is our relationship with the user groups. So the boating community, the paddlers, the cycling community, the fishing community. So, I mean, I think that we have the potential, if we do this right, and it's not an area we've done as good enough a job, I think, as we need to, of being the folks who can help the river towns understand what the needs and aspirations and interests are of the folks who fish and paddle and hike and cycle, right? And I think we need to do a better. I mean, a huge pillar of this is connecting better to the actual target audience of people we think we can engage, and basically they're doing all that stuff now. They're just not doing it necessarily on or along the Ohio, right?
Totally.
And Jack, it gets to what you're so good at, which is obviously, you know, the coming from the park perspective. I mean, you have tens of thousands of users, right? And people who pay money to have permits to go use great parks in Hamilton County. And I think we need to think through, how do we reach people who are into the outdoors, but help them understand increasingly, which is one of the benefits of the digital guide, how they can also do what they love in the Ohio, along the Ohio, and in the communities that are part of the Ohio.
Totally agree. I mean, I think about the East Coast Greenway Alliance, which has been now probably close to 25 years, and they're doing their user counts on completed sections. So it's 3,000 miles, over 1,000 miles is open. They are now up around 35, 40 million users a year. Well, that rivals any national park in the United States. I mean, and they're realizing, wow, the power of this linear corridor, and the fact that it's satisfying the needs of 30 to 40 million people a year. You do get a sense of why, you know, these projects are important, why it's important to connect them together. And you're probably dealing with, you know, hundreds of thousands of users a year along this corridor, and that are all you know looking for a way to maximize their beneficial use of the resource.
You know, I have a graduate student now who's doing counts on, you know, we picked out 9 different boat ramps, and it's quite interesting trying to track that, because our metro parks doesn't really have a good count of how many people use the river and who is using it, and when they're using it. And you know, it's a fascinating piece of research. I think that argument of us understanding the recreational value of the river is also so important.
Yep, totally.
What? Go ahead, Andrea.
Just wanted to let you know that Russ sent me a text and his computer crashed and it won't let him log in.
Okay.
Oh no.
So I'll speak for him. You know, one of the things that he and I have been working on is putting together these trail town talks with the communities, and doing that type of work of engaging the different user groups, going in for an assessment, and providing them with some resources, doing a little bit of strategic planning, helping them to see what the possibilities, the benefits are. And that's just one aspect of what our TCA has been wanting to help with, as we can make it not virtual. But we've also, Russ and I have also been talking about this inherent struggle that we see, because we have a work plan and we feel like we're heading in a direction, and these guys are so enthusiastic, and it feels like they're picking up everything, and I'm like, all right, which way do you want us to go now? And we could go everywhere, and that sort of feels like what we're doing a lot of the time. And I guess in my mind, I'm trying to put it into something that makes sense so that it can be more effective. And it's not to say that that these guys aren't doing good work, because they really are.
I think this will organize everybody's efforts. I think it'll focus everybody's efforts and energies, and make everyone feel a bit more effective and efficient with their time. If you know, that's been my experience, at least, is
Right.
to kind of organize this into these 2 parts, this more or less this action plan, which is the work that I think you're really already doing, but maybe gives it a bit more of a focused pathway and an endpoint that you're all shooting for, and then a business plan to accompany that, which is how this group I was joking the other day with them on the phone, transforms from a junkyard dog into a, an organization that's, a little bit more legitimate in providing some leadership and direction to the entire effort.
Now, just to be clear, you called them the junkyard dog.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Right. Yeah. That comes from my work, Jack, in Cincinnati, when we were working with the Mill Creek Restoration Project. The lawyers that were part of that group said to me, Chuck, we don't want to stop being the junkyard dog. We like, attaching ourselves to people's ankles and never letting go. So, but anyway, but I think those two things coupled together would I think you all would begin to feel, really good about, all the meetings that you have and all the efforts that you're putting forth, because it'll organize it into a strategy for going forward.
If I could add a third objective.
Sure.
And as Andrea so artfully said, we have a lot of enthusiasm, many directions, and sometimes we don't take full advantage of the best management practices, both of organizational development and of our field of recreation. So I say that part of it is we have a steering committee, and maybe it's professional development for our steering committee members, or is it we have all of our partners, and each partner has one liaison with that. So is there a strategy that we could all come together with, and maybe that's part of the strategic plan, but I think it really is a high level, what is a greenway, what is a recreational trail, what are we doing, and sort of have a collaborative professional development time.
Oh yeah, David, a lot of times I start working with steering groups, and what we do with steering committees is that we transition from a steering committee to a more organized platform.
Right.
And some steering committee members will choose to stay on the steering committee. Some may choose to go into a more fiduciary role. So, in fact, I'm doing that right now in the Triangle region.
Yeah, when I looked at the sort of to get my perspective on the group and what it wanted to be, there were two things that would be components of a well-developed strategic plan for this kind of group that I thought were missing or not addressed. And one of them was organizational. What kind of organization is this going to be? What's it going to look like? How's it going to work? And having, that is a big task, just making those decisions and getting to a point where your organization makes sense. And the other was funding and fundraising and resource development.
Absolutely.
Those are two missing pieces.
And that's where the business plan of this comes in, because what we would do is look at how you take the steering committee that's ad hoc, that's sort of been passion, their passion, they're there to kind of really drive this thing to a conclusion. How do you transition out of that, into that organizational framework that Gordon's talking about, and how you set yourself up as a more legitimate, if it's a 501c3 or whatever, to receive funding, and then how you manage that funding, because that's a critical part of that. So that's the business plan component. So it's really these two things, and they can actually run somewhat in parallel, and it's a kind of a flexible process, one that you kind of allow it to evolve as it will, but they're going to run somewhat parallel in development. Part of it is that the business plan component of it can take a while to set up, just because of the way, if you wanted to go through the 501c3 process, that's an IRS process, so that takes time to do that. So part of it is you can't really rush it. The action plan component goes back to some of the work that Russell and Andrea are doing with you, which is really the community outreach, connecting with the users, that kind of stuff. Really translating all of that desired collective energy into a strategic plan of how everybody moves forward on the same page in terms of the resource and the needs of the river towns and things like that. So it's kind of two things running in parallel.
Chuck, I don't know if one sort of model that I keep thinking about when I talk with this group is, you know, I've done work with smaller groups, and there are some cookie cutter kind of things that you can do. You know, here, do this this strategy, or this this network, or this steps, and you end up with a similar product most of the time. I don't see this project as cookie cutter at all. Like, it's not a one size fits all. It's not just, you know, look at the Susquehanna and do what they did, because
Correct.
it's going to be, it's big, it's complicated, it has tremendous potential outcomes that are at greater stakes than just your average little trail community.
Right.
Or a 1 mile trail that's going to impact the people who live there. And so that's where I run into struggles, is the work that we do as RTCA, not that it's cookie cutter, but, you know, we have lots of examples of where it has worked, but this is not one of those.
Yeah. Yeah, the scale of this is really big, and that's why you really have to kind of immediately look for comparables that are at this scale. And, you know, at 500 miles and 22 counties and, you know, numerous river towns, I mean, you start with the Susquehanna, and it's not that you copy what they've done, but they're a good comparable to look at. You know, how they went through the process, what were some of those, you know, the challenges that they overcame, and how they've come out on the other side of that. And it's, by the way, it's not been a smooth ride for them. I've stayed in touch with them, you know, all of these 15 years, and actually went back in probably 7 years ago and did a complete Humpty Dumpty with them over the period of a couple days, where we literally ripped the whole thing apart. You know, because they felt like they were hitting walls, you know, with their organizational framework, and they wanted to advance. So it's not that it's really smooth, but you have to have a really good starting point, and you have to have a good framework to guide you through the process. And so I think that's really what we're seeking to do with this effort as well.
You mentioned that you might that you would identify a series of steps for each one of those, and sort of see what we might be able to do, what the National Park Service people. What time frame are you looking at for that?
Well, I'm going to try over the next couple of weeks to write all this up and send it to you guys. And then, and again, you know, it's a draft. It's my interpretation of where everybody is, and, you know, circulate it to all of you, let you guys take a look at it. And then we, you know, we sort of begin the back and forth of making adjustments, modifications, additions, subtractions, that kind of stuff. I'll kind of lay out what would be my interpretation. And then we can bat that back and forth and refine it into and I'm only focusing really on a scope of work. I mean, a work program, not trying to define who does what at this point, but really just what the essential work program is. Once we get to the end of that process, then we can begin to decide who's best suited to take on different elements of it if we've come to an agreement on the work program itself.
And if you don't mind me asking, even though it's 15 years ago, how much did it cost the Susquehanna people to have your services?
Well, it was a very large contract that involved more than just this component. I mean, I think I'll have to go back and look, David, as to what the total contract value was. I mean, but there was a lot more that we did, because we were undertaking the community engagement components and the GIS work and the master plan mapping, and I mean, there was a lot more. But, you know, I think that at a minimum, this kind of work in the consultant world is, you know, $50,000 to $100,000, and it probably goes up from there. So but that's just speaking in very broad generalities. I mean, I think we really have to just figure out what the work program is first, independent of what the cost would be. I think we have to decide on what the optimal work program is, that everyone feels like we're checking all the right boxes. And then we can figure out who does the work and what the costs would be that are assigned to that work.
Okay. Jack, any questions? Brewster?
Yeah, I went to the Susquehanna website after we met with you last, 2 weeks ago, and I didn't spend a lot of time on there, just sort of browsed around. But given that it's been 15 years, I couldn't find that original action plan. Is there maybe somebody you could introduce us to that we could, I would just sort of like to see an example of what's in that action plan, the type of scope of work or type of scope of action that was discussed.
I'll send you the link.
Okay, perfect.
It's buried in that website.
Well, I wasn't very patient. I didn't spend a lot of time searching.
No, and it would have taken you a while to find your way to it. So
Okay.
I will send you the link to the action plan.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, send that to all of us, please.
Yep. No problem.
Brewster, any comments?
No, I just I like the way you think about what needs to be done, Chuck, and I hope we can figure out a way of working with you. Obviously, we have to raise money, and that's something we haven't developed a strategy to do yet. We also have other expenses that we need to raise money for,
Sure.
Just to maintain and promote the operation, from the website to materials for educational and marketing materials, etc. But that's the biggest challenge, I think. If we could hire you for $10, great, I'll write you the check. If we could hire you for $1,000, great, I'd write you the check. The challenge here is how do we come up with the bucks in order to bring your services and experience to the table to help us out. So I think, to me, it's a super operational question, unless Andrea and Russ want to write a check to us.
Well, just to be fair, Brewster, that's always this is
Sure.
the big issue I always face. And
right.
If I could have earned my living on the amount of people who said no and the amount of people who said we don't have the money, then it'd be a different kind of story. Yeah. But those are very common challenges. I wouldn't get too stressed about that right now, because we'll cross that bridge when we get there. I think the most important thing to focus on right now is coming up with a work program that everyone feels like gives you the best path forward.
Right.
And then we can decide, who does what and how much money you really have to raise, and how much, if I'm involved, how much I would take out of all that, and so on and so forth.
Sure.
That's kind of the world of landscape architecture. So,
Russ or Andrea, any final comments?
I'd just like to say, sorry I couldn't listen to the whole thing. I had a computer crash, and I'm glad to be back. So I will hopefully get filled in as time goes on. But Chuck, it's been a pleasure to meet you. I'm looking forward to the possibility of being able to work with you. I came from private practice as well. I had a consulting company in Michigan for 32 years, landscape architects. And I know there's a lot of insight that the private sector can bring to this type of effort. And your experience being right there, I think would be very beneficial. And from the standpoint of our TCA, Andrew and I have talked, we're willing to model our effort and shape our effort to work around where your strong points are, and we can see what we can do to pick up the other areas to move this forward.
Absolutely.
The project. So.
Yeah, I've worked with RTCA for 30 years.
All right, great.
And been in and out of relationships with RTCA for many, many years. So,
Gordon, do you have any final thoughts?
Nope.
Well, I
well,
wish
good.
to
Well,
thank everybody.
yeah, thank you, David. I'll get to work, and I'll shoot you guys something to look at. And like I say, it'll be draft. So, if you the idea is to start circulating something that gets the conversation going and it matures the conversation. So, and I don't take any offense. So you can say whatever you want about whatever I submit as a draft. I'm not offended by anything anybody would say. I think we just have to advance the conversation.
We might, or we will, as I said, we have a Monday, the first Monday in July conference call, and we'll send out that and have a discussion and get back with you ASAP, I'm
Sounds
excited.
good.
I want to go forward, and to echo what Gordon says, let's think big.
Absolutely.
You know, and have an Ohio River Greenway, you know, or have a Ohio River Recreation Greenway, or whatever we want to call it. You know, I think there's benefits for all of it. But I'm looking forward to it.
Sounds great. Well, have a great rest of the week, everyone, and enjoyed our call today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Okay. This is the deal.
Thank you, Jack. What'd you think? Oh.